Good evening. Welcome to the Mumbai Curtain Raiser to the ZEE Jaipur Literature Festival 2015. As Margaret Alba rightfully pointed out, it is the Kumbh of literature. From Nobel laureates to local language writers, prize winners to debut novelists, every January a collection of the most remarkable, witty, sensitive and brilliant authors come together over 5 days of readings, debates and discussions at the beautiful Dighi Palace in Jaipur. On behalf of the Jaipur Literature Festival, we have a short 5-minute preview of the magic you can expect.
I welcome you here for this 8th edition of the ZEE Jaipur Literature Festival. We must allow our authors their space. We must allow our authors their freedom of being able to present their views. And I give to you this year, ladies and gentlemen, 248 authors that our wonderful festival directors have brought together from across the world.
You hear over and over again in the media how no one is reading books, how newspaper sales are falling, how everyone is obsessed with Twitter and Facebook and movies and TV, and real intellectual life is dying. This festival, the incredible response from people all over India and the world to it, and the 60 festivals which have sprung up in imitation of it, is an incredible demonstration that this is not the case.
Every year, come January, the lawns of Dighi Palace overflow with readers and writers and book lovers as the world visits Jaipur, as Jaipur visits the world.
Every January, some of the greatest writers and thinkers from across South Asia and indeed the world come together for 5 days of readings, debates and discussions at Dighi Palace. One may, to use the analogy of a centuries-old free festival in this part of the world, called the Jaipur Literature Festival, the Kumbh of literature.
Jaipur Literature Festival has become like a part of our festival calendar.
Classical education in language, literature, music and the arts is being seriously neglected in India. Very few people study Sanskrit anymore, nor do they study ancient Persian or Latin or Greek or Arabic or Hebrew or Old Tamil. We need serious cultivation of classical studies for a balanced education.
And when you write, you must realize that you have to write for yourself. You're writing because a blessing has come to you, and that book serves a purpose for your soul. So care two hoots about editors, publishers, critics and frankly even readers. Write only for yourself.
Is it really on the rise, or is it just better detection?
Cancer is a collection of diseases that have common mechanisms but appear in different forms or due to different risk factors in different parts of the world.
In the either or, you know, that also comes cultures that are into masculine and feminine. They think there are only two alternatives. You know, in my press, they're always saying there are two sides to every issue, and I'm always saying, wait a minute, maybe there are 6.
फेस्टिवल की वजह से ही हमें आज इतने सारे लेखकों को जानने का मौका मिला, उनसे मिलने का मौका मिला, जो कि एक बहुत बड़ी अपॉर्चुनिटी थी।
Jaipur Literature Festival glorifies a lot of authors who are otherwise not very famous, and their writing comes out. So I think it's extremely important to have these kind of gatherings every year.
Aware of conversations in my own home in America when I was a young girl of my parents and their friends trying to piece together the details of something that was overtaking their city.
In my lifetime, so much of American culture has been exported in the form of technology, in the form of television, in the form of a consumer way of life.
Music programs, even musicians also sort of to come to get a platform for discussions.
Tonight, Avid Learn in association with the ZEE Jaipur Literature Festival, the British Council and Penguin India presents two esteemed literary stalwarts. Editor-in-Chief of DNA, C.P.Surendran, in conversation with author Amit Chaudhuri on his latest novel, Odysseus Abroad. Setting himself with the ambitious task of reworking Homer's Odyssey and Joyce's Ulysses, Amit has beautifully managed to cover the Bengali milieu, loneliness, friendship, and an Indian immigrant's experience in living in London in this almost autobiographical novel. Amit Chaudhuri is an award-winning author, scholar, and musician. He has written 5 novels, 1 work of non-fiction, and a number of books of literary criticism. Among the many prizes he has won for his fiction are the Commonwealth Literature Prize, the Betty Trask Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the Infosys Prize, and the Sahitya Academy Award. He is also a highly respected critic, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and professor of contemporary literature at the University of East Anglia. C.P.Surendran is the author of 4 collections of poetry: Portraits of the Space We Occupy, Canaries on the Moon, Posthumous Poems, and Gemini 2. His novels include An Iron Harvest, Lost and Found, and Tears of the Crying Squad, which is scheduled to be released later this month. His debut screenplay, Gaur Hari Dastan, was selected for 5 international film festivals last year. He is currently working on a collection of poems titled Repeat Radio, and he is at present the editor-in-chief of DNA. He divides his time between Mumbai and Delhi. I'd now like to invite our speakers to please come up on stage.
I think, Amit doesn't actually need any introduction at all. What I think we should do, is very great to see that, there's so many people here to listen to him. I must tell you that, when I was in Oxford for a short while, I was in St. Anthony's College and I had no money, but I now recall that I have never had any money at any point in my life. So I was actually living off the biscuits and some milk, which was kept in the college canteen below, and I used to smuggle myself into the kitchen pantry and eat those. And having done that, I would sleep well. In the morning, I would wake up, and one morning, I actually found somebody familiar walking by the street, and that happened to be Amit. And I think after that, or was it before? Just before, I can't remember. I did a piece on his first book called Afternoon Raga. And Strange Incident. So I think what we should do now with this evening is, let Amit read for a few minutes from his book, and then we talk to each other and then throw it open to you.
Okay. So you want me to start with the reading?
I think we should do that.
Boston's are great for jazz concerts. Now, CP has given me specific instructions to read something which has a bit of conversation in it.
I would think that kind of...
The racy bits.
The racy bits,
yeah. Before I read, okay.
There's a bit of a passage where you talk about, you detect sex in the air as an absurdity.
Really? You want me to read that bit? I mean, frankly, I'm not surprised, but I was going to read out a bit, maybe I can read out that later if we have time. What I was going to do is read out a bit about the central character. But before I do that, maybe I should give it a tiny bit of backstory, unless that was already given when I was...
I think you should.
No. So the backstory is this, that, how to be brief about this. It's set in one day in London in July 1985. Actually, it's probably the 18th of July, and I've sort of calculated that because the book begins with a memory of a recent concert, the Live Aid concert, and the Anando, the young man, is kind of ranting inwardly against this concert. Shows up his kind of misanthropic characteristics. And now Ananda during that day will do a few things. He's going to rant against various things inwardly, as I said, and also worry about his noisy neighbors. So he lives in a studio apartment on Warren Street in London. He's an undergraduate. He studies English in a college, which is not named. And he is oppressed by the fact that he has noisy neighbors who don't let him sleep at night. They play what is, at that time, still a relatively recent form of music, rap, late into the night. And so having thought about all of that, reflected again on his homesickness, he goes out to meet his tutor, his college tutor, who is about to give him his opinion on some poems that our young man has written and has given to the tutor to assess. So then these two have a conversation. After this seemingly desultory encounter, he then goes to see his landlord at an Indian restaurant called Diwani Khas, and there he pays his landlord the rent. After having done that, he goes off to see his uncle. Uncle lives in a bedsit in Belsize Park. A bedsit, for those of you who don't know, is a form of accommodation which includes a small room and a kitchenette, but no bathroom. So it's kind of shared bath outside. And this uncle has been living in that bedsit now for, let's say, 25 years or so. He has done well. He worked in a shipping company. He was a senior manager, and then he took voluntary redundancy. Actually, he was probably made redundant. The time is, the era is Thatcher's Britain has come into existence. So that's the larger kind of frame. Now, each one of these episodes, including what happens later, so then they go back and finally they have dinner at an Indian restaurant. Each one of these episodes, chapters, are based on episodes in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey. You don't need to know those episodes, but the kind of chapter headings nudge you towards a kind of knowledge that there's some kind of play going on in that regard. And it's also, on another level, I suppose, the idea of rewriting, or let's say translating the Odyssey into present-day terms and setting all those kind of actions and events in the Odyssey in one single day in the terms of what happens in one single day in a modern city was of course Joyce's, was James Joyce's Ulysses, and which is a kind of translation, updating and parody of Homer's Odyssey. Ulysses is of course the Roman name for Odysseus. So this is a further kind of updating and parody by making, two Irishmen, young Stephen and Leopold Bloom, are respectively Telemachus and Odysseus, his father, in Ulysses. Over here, it's two Bengalis, so it's a further kind of updating and heading down that kind of road. So now that's the backstory and the context. This chapter, as I said, each chapter has a name which takes you in that particular direction, the direction of the Odyssey. This chapter is called Emmaus. Emmaus was the name of a swineherd in the Odyssey. As Odysseus began to return home, he took shelter with Emmaus but dressed as a tramp, like a swineherd himself, basically. So he was totally unrecognizable as the great king. So Emmaus was a swineherd who loved Odysseus, but does not recognize him in this incarnation. So there is a swineherd character over here. There's a Pakistani neighbor who loves the uncle, but I'm not going to be reading anything out about him. Where I begin is just after Ananda, the nephew, the Telemachus figure, the son of Odysseus, has made his entrance into his uncle's house. This is in his bedsit in Belsize Park. He entered and turned to the half-ajar door on the left. His uncle shuffled behind him, gentlemanly, slow. Actually, let me start from a little later. So imagine what happened after that. They are now in the bedsit. Plunged right into the action. Guess what I had for breakfast, said his uncle. Although Ananda knew the answer and knew his uncle knew he knew the answer, as he asked the question of his nephew each time they met up, and the answer was the same, he pretended courteously not to know because he knew his uncle wanted to tell him again. Epic theatre. The point being not to learn a new story, but to hear it with recognition, recited for the umpteenth time. So with audiences of epic sagas who'd been told the tale ad absurdum, knew the lines by heart, and delighted at being told again. Coffee with a bit of cream and 11 spoons of sugar and a quarter of a toast with half a spoon of honey. He looked distant and amused. His hunger had been exacerbated by his inadvertent mention of the Jaffa cakes. I haven't eaten anything since then. I'm burning with hunger. He seemed pleased at his feet. Pleased because his diet followed some theory of life, to do with subsistence, staying fit and lean. He worried uninterruptedly about how he looked, and with maximizing pleasure when he ate in the evening. Even then, prolonging and deferring pleasure would take precedence over killing hunger. He'd chew with infuriating slowness, holding himself in check and wading into a tantalizingly dilatory frame of time. If Ananda were eating with him, he'd be distracted from his own meal by the strangely frustrating sight of his uncle chewing. All things by dinner were universally appetizing. I could eat a horse, he'd say in restaurants, or when he came to have dinner at Warren Street. And he'd scoff at Ananda's likes and dislikes in food as finicky. He lived life by a code of punishments and rewards, withholding from himself till he was on the edge, the subsequent act of auto-kindness, then feeling like a miracle. Even his living conditions had no relation to his means, but was a deliberate act of deprivation, conditions from which he'd probably release himself one day on a whim. 11 spoons, said Ananda, disapproving. This was what he dutifully exclaimed each time. Yet he did rise to the bait. There was a genuine reprisal of surprise at his uncle's, his entire maternal clan's consumption of sugar. His grandmother had died of diabetes, his aunt had it, one of his cousins had developed the juvenile variety and took daily self-administered shots of insulin. Rangamama had no sign of the disease. He looked pleased at Ananda's veiled reprimand. And now he'll say, thought Ananda, I hardly slept last night. Still, he felt a twinge of pity. His mother had chronic insomnia. He'd often discovered her hovering near the dining table at 3 in the morning. She emerged to nibble at biscuits. Ananda had it, or he wouldn't have run into his mother. He glanced at the bed. It seemed well used, frequently inhabited. Beneath it were bottles from which he averted his gaze. They brought a urinous presence to the room, mingled sweetly with aftershave. The bottles made unnecessary that trip at 2 in the morning to the shared loo in the hallway. Although Ananda heated his flat to tropical levels, he knew the resistance you felt at night in the chill to emptying your bladder. The pressure on the sphincter muscle deepened by the very chill. He knew what it was like to coerce yourself, to liberate your body from the warm cell of the tucked-in blanket, climb off the bed, drown briefly in the cold, totter to the hallway. There were few more solitary Odysseys. Better to do it in a bottle. I slept badly last night, grumbled Rangamama. But he looked well rested. When will you be done? Nagged Ananda. His uncle had unbuttoned his shirt, draped it over a chair. He began to dab his arm with a small wet towel. Haven't had your bath? Bath? His uncle, as he swept his thin arms and shoulders, demurred to the question. No, he admitted. I had a bath last in April. It sounded dreadful, but Ananda, when he thought of it calmly and despite the evidence to the contrary, concluded his uncle wasn't unclean. Each day he cleaned himself piecemeal like a cat, pouring water over his head just 2 or 3 times annually. Maybe this was a modulation on the native mode of hygiene which he'd internalized after moving to London in 1957, when having a bath used to be a seasonal, fleeting occurrence, like the full moon or daffodils. A troublesome occurrence, according to his mother, recounting the years spent in 24 Belsize Park, in the bedsit upstairs with his father. How others would leave sooty tide marks in the tub which you had to implore them to wipe away before you went in. Still, the wallowing in soapy water in which your dirt particles settled and swam had created in Ananda's mother a taste for the warm languor of the bath, and she'd returned to it occasionally in Bombay, where middle-class people still possessed ornamental bathtubs, though they preferred the straightforward drenching of the shower. His uncle's abstinence from bathing might be put down to his general laziness, his slowness, which made the smallest things he did elements in a gigantic journey, or to his unrelenting adoption of the identity of a black Englishman. The main reason I could never have become a director at Philip Brothers, he said, was because I spent too much time in the toilet. This was one of the impediments to his taking up directorship. There were others. The toilet holds up your day. You use a lot of time. The fact that he hadn't become a director haunted him, and now it haunted Ananda, since his uncle reminded him of the fact whenever he visited. What had first set off this tireless confession of regret was the news from 3 years ago that Ananda's father, Shyotish, had become managing director of the company he worked in. Ananda's uncle and Shyotish used to be inseparable in Sylhet. Best friends, classmates. Both bright sparks, but Ananda's uncle, it was conceded, by Shyotish in particular, gifted, maybe a genius, a judgment that Ananda's uncle graciously concurred with. News came of Ananda's father's ascendancy. Ananda's uncle responded with joy. 3 days later, he began to explain, and he hadn't stopped, how Anderson, the chief at Philip Brothers, had invited him to take up an executive directorship a year ago, which he turned down. Executive director, a post with a directorship's prestige, but few of the responsibilities. But I said I wouldn't do it. What an idiot. I thought it meant I'd be traveling constantly, now to Frankfurt, now to Paris, Sao Paulo, or Madrid. That's all I wanted once, to travel, 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 the high life. By the time Anderson asked me, the job had no charm anymore. Idiot. He was buttoning his shirt. In the winter, he'd wear the three-piece suit over the pajamas. They kept him warm and were preferable to long johns. Now he made again his usual exculpatory statement. I couldn't have done it anyway. I can't start work without going to the toilet. Not evacuating your bowels and drinking milk may lead you to breaking wind at any time. Ananda ruminated on this, one of his uncle's many diagnoses to do with navigating your path through a day. Was reassured that he himself abhorred milk. In the office, I seldom went to the toilet to do the big job in case someone outside the cubicle heard me breaking wind. He made a face to indicate that that would have been a calamity. Then narrowed his eyes, conceding he was oversensitive. But he was also hinting at the stubbornness of the powers that be, that rule our lives and the universe. The gods, Aeolus, wind, had disrupted his progress. No point harping about it. He'd been made redundant after all. Or asked to take voluntary retirement if he preferred. All this business about directorship was, as they say, history. A record of events that can be resurrected only in the telling. Excuse me, Poo-Poo, he said. So should I end it there?
Yeah, maybe we can read later once we... I think we should give a clap.
That's very kind of you.
You know, there are a couple of things which I always notice about, Amit's writing. One, of course, is that there's 2 sentences, I think, in his book, which roughly perhaps explains his own attitude towards writing in the world at large. One is that a noticer of the mundane, of the everyday world. And to a great extent, Ananda himself is an exponent of that theory. And the other thing which I notice, especially in this book, is a certain kind of inconsequentiality of things. It is not necessary that things have to happen. You go into the kitchen and you put a cup down on the sink, and then you are listening to the sound of it. Perhaps because Amit himself is quite a great musician. How much of you actually have got translated into the character? Is it autobiographical really, as people seem to think?
The question about autobiography has been asked to me ever since I wrote A Strange and Sublime Address. The problem with that word is that, when you use the word biography, you are talking about the life of somebody. And auto is your own life. But along came A Strange and Sublime Address, which apparently had no story. So what kind of a story of one's life was it then that was being told, which added up to nothing? So the kind of impulse was always to talk about the moments which add up to nothing, always, to explore that, to also explore the paradoxically riveting quality, the electric quality under the surface of the nothing that surrounds us. The nothing only happens, of course, between large events. Ordinarily, the way you would construct an autobiography is to talk about the important events and leave out the moments where you're sipping tea and daydreaming, But I only was interested in the sipping tea, daydreaming, that kind of reading the paper, going and shitting, you know, that kind of thing. Walking, looking out the window. Those are not ideal events for an autobiography. So in fact, it's a total undermining of the autobiography.
I think you seem to have undermined it pretty well. There are a couple of other things which I think we should later on throw it open to the audience. And these are fairly, I think, urgent cultural issues. You know, although there is a current of irony running through the narrative. You say, for example, somewhere in the book, you know, a black Englishman, for example, or for example, a language which is only secondarily his. Do these things still trouble you? You know, you have been writing, you have been practicing in this language and literature and in this culture for close to 3 decades, if I'm not mistaken. So, does that still trouble you?
Yeah, I mean, they trouble me in a different way.
Does it trouble you politically, or does it trouble you culturally, or what's the nature of the trouble?
Let me first explain why these kind of sentences or perspectives occur in the book. So, one had to do with Ananda's general disgruntled air and him thinking, for instance, his dislike of the British, of the English, and thinking to himself, you know, I hate being in London, and also thinking about the language. You know, this language is not really mine, you know, as much as it is theirs. That was one thing you mentioned, and the other one was what was the other?
Was it political or cultural?
The black Englishman. The black Englishman. Okay. No. So first to give you the reasons as to why they occur in the book, and then I can tell you about whether or not they trouble me. So the reason that the first thing occurs in the book, this Ananda's reflections, is of course partly because I myself was deeply unhappy in London at the time, and this was part of my subject matter in this.
But that's your nature. You're deeply unhappy whatever happens.
That's true. No, it's a very very well succinctly made and well made. But except when having a nice conversation. But the fact is that I was maybe unhappy in all kinds of unproductive ways, and in ways to do with race, you know, over there. Because early 80s, mid 80s, I was still very much aware of being racially out of place in Britain. You know, this was still the time after William Whitelaw had introduced the virginity tests. You know, so the people who had spouses joining, women joining their spouses, or so-called spouses, alleged spouses, in the UK, had to go through virginity tests because it was apparently a well-known fact that all Indian women are virgins when they marry. So if they weren't virgins and they weren't genuine experience, but still. No, this is the early 80s. So anyway, so that there was that context. How do I put it to use over here? How do I put my own disaffection to use over here? I put it to use because I'm echoing Stephen, and I'm echoing Telemachus. So Stephen is somebody in Ulysses and in Portrait of the Artist as a young man who's deeply unhappy with the British, with the English. And in Portrait of the Artist as a young man, he actually has a conversation with a priest, an English priest, and he thinks, well, that is his language, much more than it is mine. And I'm echoing him when I make that statement. But I'm echoing him only because I did have an undercurrent of that feeling, and now I'm able to make use of it. And all that stuff that I'm describing here, where Ananda is ranting against Live Aid, against London, about everything that's going on around him, is to make a reference to Homer's story and the character of Telemachus, who also in his own house feels powerless, feels out of place. Telemachus and Penelope are in Ithaca at the beginning of the Odyssey, and Odysseus hasn't returned for 10 years. and Telemachus, and the house is full of what Homer calls, or the translator of Homer calls, the suitors, the people who want to marry Penelope and are saying to her, what on earth are you waiting for? You know, Odysseus is dead, marry one of us. And every day they create a disruption. And it's in various ways I'm referring to Telemachus' sense of unease and dispossession in his own home as I talk about these things, and also in fact talk about his noisy neighbors, the people who listen to rap. I mean, for me, the beginning of the story came with various convergences. One of them was this, that I could use my memory of those noisy neighbors to play, to have them, the noisy neighbors, play the part of the suitors. Black Englishmen at that time, see the early 80s, late 70s, England was only emerging from two racial categories, black and white. You know, and so so Indians would often call themselves black and were called black until the category Asian emerged as distinct from black. So my uncle would call himself a black Englishman, thereby also distancing himself from Bengalis. And I just thought, again I thought, how wonderful it would be to have a black Odysseus, for Odysseus to be black. And I was almost tempted, except that I thought this is going to look too post-colonial. I was almost tempted to call the novel Black Odysseus, but I did not. Just your last thing is about what I feel about my feelings of discomfort today about the question of what is it writing in English or I mean, as I began,
the reason why I'm asking you is that you have been trying very, very hard to escape your Bengaliness for so long. There's no way you can do it. So, is that a struggle?
You know, I was about to say that before you made that wild generalization, I was about to say, no, well put. I was about to say that until a particular age, you know, given the kind of parents I had as well, given the kind of ethos I grew up in, given what it meant to be a Bengali at that time, and I grew up in Bombay. Until a particular age, yes, I felt guilty. I felt I cannot write authentically in another's tongue. The moment that kind of became, it ceased to be a problem to me, that moment I kind of began to inhabit the language in a particular way. But today I would say I'm very unhappy about the unequal attention given to Indian languages and the English language. And I wouldn't say this for any of the usual reasons. I really don't think that the Indian languages like, let's say, Bengali, Urdu, Hindi, Tamil, Kannada, I really don't think, even if they're deemed classical languages, more and more of these languages want to call themselves classical languages. That doesn't solve anything. I really don't think that these languages represent some unbroken lineage of pure Indianness. That's not what I'm talking about. I think that these languages contain very powerfully the efflorescence and the arrival of modernity in India. So if you want to look at where it is that avant-garde experimentation, modernism took place, you have to go to Bengali, you have to go to Kannada. You only see a bit of that from, say, a filmmaker like Satyajit Ray. But where is Satyajit Ray coming out of? I think our knowledge of what modern literature is in India, or has been in India in the last 200 years, or what modernity is in India, or has been in the last 200 years, or what avant-garde experimentation is truncated severely if we don't know the Indian languages. So we don't turn to the Indian languages to find out about Hinduism, elephants, or conch, whatever. The noise of the conch being blown. We go there to find out about cities, about city spaces, about modernity. This is what you find so powerfully in those languages. We go there to find out about this particular expression of the secular. So what do I mean by the secular? I mean, so when a writer begins to say, I love writing about, the smell of piss on a wall, it's obviously not something that's been quoted from the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita. It could be. Those are also very subversive texts. But it's obviously something that is part of a secular assignation of significance. Only a secular person with a secular aesthetic would say that writing about a derelict house smelling of urine is somehow beautiful or interesting. It's a totally secular, modern sort of expression of what is powerful or beautiful. Now, in India, this expression takes place in the Indian languages in the last 200 years. So now, if we don't know that, we also know very little about our life as a secular nation. What it is that gives meaning to being secular in India and has given meaning in the last 200 years. We know very little about it.
I'm sure that you people, almost all of you must have read, at least when you were young, James Joyce. It's one of the great sentences of Joyce is to, through Stephen, is to say that, to forge the conscience of the race. That sentence finds echoes and resonance in this Odysseus book of Amit. But I was going to ask you, in terms of height, sight, and wisdom. The second one exactly, I knew, not wisdom. To forge the conscience of which race? Are you talking about the human race? Are you talking about the English race? And how does, you get what I'm trying to say? I'm sure that Joyce was talking about the human race, but now that language is no longer limited to one particular geography or history, do you think writing in the regional languages and the politics of that still hold some sort of validity now? Is that fight gone? What I'm trying to say is that, I'm trying to go back into the old sentence which Rushdie said, writing in English is to hold a conversation with the world. And those people who are not conversing with the world are marginals. Do you think that fight has gone out of fashion? Are we still fighting that fight?
So the first thing about Stephen's statement, forging the conscience of a race, is that part of the reason that it's so attractively sort of grandiloquent is that it is grandiloquent and it is partly ironical. I mean, the person who's saying it is an Irishman. The Irishman as cosmopolitan is even more doomed, should have been more doomed as a figure than the Bengali as a cosmopolitan. Because the Irish were completely looked down upon in empire. They had no status at all. So, so it's within that, when a person says that, within that kind of context, then the irony in that statement gives it a particular energy. So if a Bengali writer or a Kannada writer were to say, as a Bengali writer rather than a world poet or whatever, like Tagore became, were to speak about forging the conscience of a race, and you know that he's talking about a village in Karnataka, that irony is what gives it its meaning. If once Indian writers in English who also are kind of quasi-diplomats or bureaucrats, in the sense that they could be...
my question actually is that, is language any more political?
that it was at one time very political. Is it any longer political? Because we live necessarily in a very consumerist world. So do languages reflect in the literature?
The thing about, maybe we're getting into kind of, I don't know, abstruse.
Out of this, are you guys involved in this?
You're involved? Okay, these two people have said that they're involved. So we can take
the
them
constituents of the race.
Yeah, we can take them as being fairly representative. Yeah, let's look at Joyce and the English language for a second. And let's also compare it with Bengal, because there's a Bengali, there are two Bengalis over here. Two Sylhetis, so they're not proper Bengalis, they're looked down by other Bengalis, looked down upon by other Bengalis. So there's kind of this play, this comic play, going on everywhere. Now what happened in Ireland was quite interesting in that the great Irish modernists, the great Irish writers who wrote in modernity, whether it was Joyce, whether it was Yeats, a very different kind of writer, and various other people who came after them, Kavanagh, right up to Heaney, whatever. There's a whole bunch of them. But it's only secondarily that they seem to write, I mean they write about Ireland, but secondarily about Irish identity. First and foremost, they're writing as moderns. It's the ambivalence of modernity that inflects their text, which is why Heaney is not interchangeable with Joyce, and Joyce is not interchangeable with Yeats, and no paragraph in Ulysses is interchangeable with another. So with Rushdie you can say, and this is to demean him as a writer and misread him, but it is constantly done. You can say Rushdie wrote a khichdified language, but then you pick any two paragraphs and they are examples of this chutnification or khichdification. And you don't have to look at the individuality of what he's doing or playing around with. Now, but when you look at Ulysses, you cannot do this. You cannot say, Joyce wrote a Gaelic tongue, and it's all mystically kind of Gaelic, and you don't have to actually read these paragraphs individually. They're all kind of examples of this marvelous Gaelic hybridity. Every sentence in Joyce invites to be read differently from the other sentence, which means that Joyce is not dependent on a reading to do with identity. He is a great modern writer. What is interesting is that the Irish write as moderns in English. When they try to undertake it in Gaelic, what they produce is a kind of museum piece, mostly. I mean, I'm sure there will be some Gaelic writers who will strangle me. But by and large, the project in Gaelic is not a success. It's not a great modern or modernist project. It is a project totally identified with identity, and therefore remains a curio. Now, but the Bengalis don't do that, and nor do the writers in other languages. I mean, Bengali languages, again, the emergence of Bengali is about writing as a modern, but writing in Bengali. It's not, Bengali is not like Gaelic. It's not just a curio to do with Bengali identity. It's to do with writing about the ambivalences of what it means to live in modernity. So, the question of how politics plays out in these languages is not a simple one. It's not directly related to identity.
Okay, to get away from that question, one of the little I remember of Homer and less I remember of Virgil. In both contexts, Odysseus is not a very nice person. He is seen as a cunning guy in one, as in the Virgil actually talks about him as a cruel guy.
His name means troublemaker.
Troublemaker.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you have taken him on as your representative. No, so why would you actually see Rangamama as one of the main characters here as someone who is cunning or is a little off track, but he's not cunning, he's not really sort of guile or anything. What was the reason why you chose him as?
He's just a person who talks a lot, but whom you can't trust.
Okay.
I mean, and he's a bit of a troublemaker. See how he gets on Ananda's nerves. and how he antagonizes his family. I mean, he's a troublemaker.
Okay. Another thing which is again largely cultural, which I think is of some interest to me because I am generally seen or perceived as a misogynist. If only you know how with what dread and fear I approach women. Anyway, in your book, there's Dr. Hilary Burton, who is a tutor for Ananda.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And somewhere you do mention that Hilary Burton as a feminist and Ananda as a romantic of sorts.
Yeah.
I do
as an unreconstructed romantic.
Yeah.
Which is why Hilary Burton doesn't really like him.
Is that the reason why?
Yeah, that's
there's a context where you talk about where Ananda perceives sex as an absurdity hanging in the
that's
air.
partly happening in his head.
It's not really
happening. It might have. I mean, epic storytellers don't tell you.
No, my question actually is. Question actually is, what is Ananda, and to some extent yours, perspective on women's rights?
On women's rights?
Yes.
On women's rights.
If Hilary Burton came your way, would you fall in love with her?
Would I fall in love with her?
Or lust with her?
But how is that connected to women's rights?
Why not? Because she's a feminist.
You tell me what you
what I'm saying is she's a very strong-headed feminist.
Yeah.
This guy's a romantic. Very clearly.
Feminists don't deny men falling in lust with them.
I think a lot of them do. As a matter of fact, You don't believe so? Do you believe that isn't it easier to fall in love with a woman who is not constantly talking about her rights? No? Yes? No? Maybe? I know it's a man's perspective and I'm sorry about it, but I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
So, what are your perspectives on this?
No, this is too delicate a question. Why? I see lots of feminists in the audience, and I want to sell a few copies. Sell a few copies of my book, yeah.
Why don't you read that passage?
Read that bit? Of course. The sex bit.
Anyway, you're really keen.
I'll tell you what. I'll read out that bit about Hilary Burton. I'll read out this little bit about it. Just give me a second as I try and find out. He's going to meet his tutor, but he's thinking about his tutor in the first year. He's in the second year now, with whom he didn't get on. Ananda and Hilary Burton didn't get on. This was established early, though there was a show of encouraging cordiality on Dr. Burton's side. Ananda wasn't decided if he wanted to have sex with Dr. Burton, though at times he thought he did, but not at the cost of his dignity as a young man of letters. That's how he conceived of himself. And he wasn't sure if she wanted to have sex with him, though there were times he thought she did, despite or maybe impelled by their unspoken animosity. The problem should have been clear, but it wasn't, at least to Ananda, that Dr. Burton was a feminist and a rather sophisticated advocate of French feminist critical theory, and that she saw Ananda as an unreconstructed romantic, thin but glowing with universal ideals, and an unforgiving discontent with all he deemed unworthy of literature. Ananda, typical of his gender, took literature as a given, a sacred fact. Imagine his confusion when he had to write his first tutorial essay on Troilus and Crusade and discovered that the word poet, as he understood it, was quite inappropriate to Chaucer. Try to cut to the really juicy bits.
Well, I didn't mark it properly, but there's not too many lines actually. No, but if you're finding it difficult,
No, I just read out a few paragraphs. Yeah. The brightest students do medieval studies. No, that's not juicy. Dr. Burton was a medievalist. She was an expert on Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The one reason that Ananda didn't dismiss Dr. Burton's preoccupations out of hand was because he'd read somewhere that Ted Hughes had been nourished by these strange consonantal poems, whose language was as harsh as the English winter. The recent English poets Ananda had read a great deal of: Larkin, Gunn, Hughes, Causley, Tomlinson. One of the reasons he gravitated towards this college, making the voyage out from Bombay, where the college had no separate meaning for him, unlike Oxford or Cambridge, was because Stephen Spender was here. When he applied for a place, he knew Spender had retired, only just, and even today this was a cause of heartbreak. No, but this is not about sex.
Don't you worry about it. I think we got enough now.
Anyway, so there is, I mean, as we go through the literature, we end up,
Sleeping together.
Sleeping together.
Right. So, I think we have sort of covered most of the aspects of the book in terms of culture, language, feminism, yeah. Which he thought was a difficult question. Yeah,
well, what was the question? I wasn't very clear about it.
It's very simple. The question was that, you have a feminist there, but also a medievalist, very forbiddingly. And there is Ananda who is a bit of a romantic. And I was just wondering...
I'll tell you what this is about.
Yeah.
This is a particular kind of feminist. She's not an American-style feminist who believes in going out on the street and burning bras.
Right.
She comes after that. She's a critical theorist. Now, so in keeping with critical theory, she thinks that certain forms of writing are male. She thinks romanticism is male. Following Derrida and Kristeva, who she mentioned, she would think that these are kind of phallic, ambitious enterprises, rather than diffuse, erotic, feminist or feminine enterprises. Now, in the midst of this, here comes young Ananda, who is lusting after this woman, but is temperamentally, he's after all very young, temperamentally totally romantic and therefore very male. He's thinking of literature as being transcendental, it has inherent kind of qualities of beauty. All of these Hilary Burton would see as being unreconstructed male prejudices. That's the level of the tension. But at the same time, there is this kind of thing going on between them, which is a sexual tension, which is funny.
I think maybe we should throw the session open to you guys and questions, answers, observations, stones, tomatoes.
So, CP's question is, would you follow good evening everyone, I'm Vandana Shah. I also try to write, though not for a living. You can't make a living as an author, at least in India. And I just wanted CP's question, he says that it's more difficult to fall in love with feminists, Do you feel the same?
To fall in love with feminists? Why would you want to do that? He asked me two things: to fall in love, to fall in lust. Right?
Bit of both.
Bit of both. And I mean, I think this is a profound question, but I'm not kind of equipped to answer it.
Why are you not equipped?
No, because I'm just taking it on a very sort of mundane level, and I think it's possible to fall in love and fall in lust with anyone. Yeah. I mean, men, when it comes to falling in love, are extremely subjective. And if they were to marry somebody who had particular ideologies or tastes which they didn't understand, I think many of them would become educated in those ideologies and tastes, in case they weren't earlier. And when it comes to lust, they're very undiscriminating. So there's a question of subjectivity and there's a total lack of discrimination, which people with testosterone are doomed to. So I don't think feminist is something that would bother. Hasn't the nature...
hot feminist a man would lust after?
No, even not a hot feminist. I mean, the nature of feminism itself has changed, hasn't it? I mean, so it would be very difficult for a man to kind of spot any woman who's a feminist or not a feminist for that matter. You know, these ideas have now percolated among sort of everybody. So how, I mean, the kind of positions taken in the 70s or 60s or 70s have now informed life much more pervasively. So how do you make out, unless the man is a total idiot?
No, but
who is not a feminist? A man who's not a feminist.
In the North, you have women have zero rights, and they are okay with that. You know,
yeah, but you're asking me. I'm not a man from the North.
Yeah, so you're saying that feminism has percolated and it's evolved.
Percolated among not from the men. Yeah. Okay, the men from the North are to be accepted from that
world.
Yeah,
altogether.
Are there any men from the North here? Anyone else? Yeah.
You also mentioned that he was a romantic and therefore a male. So are you being subversive there? Because
sorry?
I always think of a woman as being a romantic, not a male as being a romantic.
No, I was using the word romantic in a literary sense. Like the romantics, like,
yes.
Like Coleridge, Wordsworth, etc. And also in a philosophical sense, the German Romanticism.
Yes.
All the big kind of projects, there's, what's his name again? Caspar, somebody, the great Friedrich, the great German romantic painter. He habitually kind of paints men standing on a mountain slope looking out. So this whole idea of being alone, individual, and on the top of a summit is a form of, it's something that comes down from romanticism, German romanticism, and then it also directs the way we think about, let's say, corporate managers. We often think of corporate managers as men on top of a summit looking out. And this is a legacy of romanticism which a feminist who's formed in the 80s by a certain kind of theory would say is deeply male. That's what I'm talking about.
And you also mentioned that moments that add up to nothing are usually encased between two large events. So is that the same case in this book?
Yeah.
Do you have considerably important events? Because from what we have read so far,
no, there are no important events.
Okay, it's just
there are no important events whatsoever. As I said, this is a parody of something which one might say was an important occurrence or an important epic. The story of Odysseus coming back home, fighting various obstacles. One of the obstacles, I think, was Aeolus, the god of wind, was beset him. Now over here I've parodied it in this way. I've mentioned it, wind in the terms of breaking wind. And he says that breaking wind was an impediment to my being. That's why I didn't become a director. So now this is the parody that's taking place on various levels. Yes, there are important events, but to me, I find important events deeply boring. I think
it sounds so much more like the portrait of an artist as a young man rather than, because that was also.
I feel closely to I feel close to kind of those kind of writers of modernism. I feel very close to Joyce, and I feel close to the idea of the mundane, of the worldly. The word mundane comes from the Latin word for the world or the earth. I like the kind of the writing which is a discovery of the earthly, of the mundane, and the kind of writing which is about the important events is for me a particular kind of vulgarized history writing. It's the news. The news is about is a constant kind of narrative about important events, and I know that Indians are one of the things that they're deeply fond of is the news. So for me, it's always a task to get them away from the news into this other domain. And then it has to do with narrative technique as well, which is very important to the modernists. But you have to see that for the modernists, it was writing about reality in a particular way, or about the important events in a day in a particular way, that was boring. I mean, Virginia Woolf talks about the awful business of the realist novelist having to describe everything that happened between breakfast and dinner.
But that is like stream of consciousness writing, but I don't see that in your what you read.
It's not. I mean, it's not stream of consciousness in any overt sense. It's associative. I don't think writing has to be overtly kind of positioned as stream of consciousness. I think. I mean. Does one go deeper into this question?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Because I think the best way of actually finding out and figuring out is to read the book. Yeah. Anyone else?
No, someone else. CP, I want to ask. I want to add something about stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness is a term invented by William James, Henry James's brother, the philosopher, and he came up with this term probably in 1891. Okay, 1891, he writes this book called Psychology, and an essay on psychology, in which he comes up with the term stream of consciousness. Now, it makes its way into literature not with Joyce, but much earlier with Tagore. With Tagore. Now, let me tell you, and then we'll understand a bit more clearly about what we mean by stream of consciousness. It's not just kind of the Joycean text. Or the Woolfian. But Woolf is, again, very different from Joyce. But let's see what Tagore does with it. So Tagore says, I'm going to talk about the importance of Bengali nursery rhymes. So he writes an essay, Chele Purano Chhora. The rhymes to entrance children is the literal translation. And he says, there's something wonderful about these Bengali nursery rhymes. He's writing this in 1895. So 1894 or 85, so about 3 or 4 years after William James's essay. And he says there's something wonderful about these Bengali children's nursery rhymes. And he says, my reason, I mean, I know that there are many Bengali historians right now, he says, this is the late 19th century, who are working towards collecting the oral culture, the folk culture of our country of Bengal. And it is true. Lal Bihari Dev, various other people are collecting and making very, very important works for the first time out of collecting oral culture. He says, I am no expert in all of this. My interest is not the interest of a nationalist. That is what they were doing, to show that Bengal too had a rich oral tradition. They went around and did great work collecting all these various things, folk tales, etc. So he said, this is not why I'm interested in the Bengali nursery rhyme. I'm interested in it because it does something which adult consciousness does not do. He says, if you look at these Bengali nursery rhymes, there's one line, and then there's this other line, and then there's a third line. None of these lines follow each other. They almost seem arbitrary. And he says, they seem to pick up something which the on and on nature of the adult consciousness does not. And he compares it with a river, the consciousness with the river and with a stream. And he says, you know, Nitto Prabahito Chetana Mache, the daily stream of our consciousness. This is the phrase he uses in Bengali. He says, picks up not only the important things, but all kinds of things, he said. You know, it picks up twigs, leaves, etc. It's all kinds of debris. And he says the adult consciousness filters that out, the on and on consciousness. But the child's nursery rhyme has kept this debris. And that's one of the first expressions of what stream of consciousness and its relationship to the everyday, to the mundane, what we consider too unimportant, too inconsequential, what that might be. Tagore does that in this essay on children's nursery rhymes.
Thank you.
Hi. So I think my question is basically, since you were writing about somewhat a personal experience back in the 80s, have you ever found yourself applying a level of self-censorship, in the sense that, you know, maybe you're writing and it's personal and there are certain observations about a foreign culture, and if there is an activation of some subaltern identity at the same time, you may be feeling things, or you may want to write observations or feelings that may not be very positive, but do you find yourself softening those observations because you don't want to ruffle feathers? I mean, does that thought ever occur to you that
No.
Someone's going to read this and then...
It doesn't occur to me because I lack that kind of faculty. I mean, something in me, I realized later, is seriously deficient in the kind of ruffling your feathers or what would be sort of readable or popular, whatever, that faculty, deficient in that. I'll tell you in what sense there is a kind of curtailment. In the formal sense, that you shape your work. And although there are some works that I've written which are long by my standards, like The Immortals or Calcutta 2 Years in the City, generally I've sort of been drawn to the shorter narratives, the novella, the short novel. I hate the marginalization of the short novel in Anglophone culture. Although there is still more of a place for it in American writing than there is in English writing. But if you look at European writing, and if you look at Indian writing in Indian languages, you see that it is full of the novella and short story. And so I don't believe in including everything, in saying everything. But not because I don't want to offend people, but because I'm drawn to the formal, to the form. I want to shape, and shape is important to me more than totally reflecting life or even reflecting the nation. So if you want to reflect the nation, then you write a big novel. I don't want that. I'm against that particular kind of relationship between the novel and the nation. So in that sense, there is curtailment, the curtailment of shaping.
I'm afraid we are running out of time. I think the stage belongs to Amit. The books are here. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, C.P.
Thank you so much, Amit and C.P. for that insightful discussion. Do join Avid Learning in Jaipur for our panel discussion on contemporary Pakistani art with Salima Hashmi, Kamila Shamsi and Dr. Alka Pandey on Friday the 23rd of January. And for the month of February, we're also curating and presenting all the writing workshops at this year's Kala Ghoda Festival from the 8th to the 15th of February. Following which, on the 27th of February, we have Cameron Bailey, the Artistic Director of the Toronto International Film Festival, in conversation with renowned film critic Anupama Chopra. We would like to thank our partners, Sanjoy Roy and Shuli Sethi from the ZEE Jaipur Festival team and Penguin India. We would like to extend our special thanks to the British Council, Sharon Memis, Director of West India, and Renuka Rubin. To close the evening, could I request Sharon Memis to please make a few comments?
Thank you very much. As I say, I'm the Director of the British Council here in West India. I'm fairly recently arrived, so I probably don't know very many of you, but look forward to getting to know you. And I just really wanted to thank you both. That was a fabulous conversation, and I think a wonderful curtain raiser for the ZEE Jaipur Festival. So I'm sure anyone who can go will have a fabulous time. And it's been great working with Penguin and with Asad at Avid, and we're delighted to work with them. I know Renuka and my team have been working away, because I have to confess this is actually my first day back in the office, so I've done nothing except sort of zoom in, and everybody else does all this work, and they're saying, right, you've got something to zoom in, that's fantastic. But what I found actually sort of particularly interesting when I was sort of reading a quick summary is that in a sense, my father was originally from Turkey and went to study in the UK with the British Council, as it happens, in 1945, end of the war, and he had to go by boat, so there was a sort of voyage from Turkey and going in these convoys and through the Bay of Biscay, where he prayed to get bombed because he was so seasick. And his stories of his encounters of arriving in the UK and living there and studying at university and learning English and staying with families, and some of the things that happened to him. And I suspect that his sentiments about the UK, at least initially, were very similar to yours. He was, I think, deeply unhappy until he happened to fall in love with my mother, who was an Irish Catholic. And when they married, he being a militant secular Muslim, who'd never been into a mosque before, but they still had to get permission from the Pope to get married, and then I think life got a little happier for him. But I hope that you then got to like London a little more, and you got to like the UK a little more. My father stayed, of course, right there, but always refused to get British nationality until both my sister and myself started living all over the world, and he realized he had to get visas. And he at that point took British nationality, but very, very grudgingly did he swear allegiance to the Queen. And then, of course, I end up working for the British Council and have a photograph of the Queen in my office. And I'm there promoting, as I say, I always say I don't promote the UK. What I promote is, and what I encourage, is greater understanding between people in the UK and people in other countries, which often involves holding the mirror up to ourselves and saying, this is what we're like really, which is why I love reading non-British people writing about the UK, because it's a much more interesting insight. So I look forward to getting your book and to reading it, and really thank you very much. We have a little bit of promotion for the British Council though. We do have a fairly kind of interesting and exciting period of events coming up in the arts, from exhibitions through to celebrating a certain famous playwright called William Shakespeare, and we have a lot of things happening. We're looking at some quite interesting ideas around that. So if you'd like to be informed of what we're doing, we're setting up a new newsletter. If you wanted to give your contact details to my colleague Renuka, who's going to wave her arm in the air, and she will put you on our mailing list, and then I hope to see you at many more events. But thank you, that was a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.